I'm a Brooklynite.
I'm by Lefferts, Prospect
Okay.
Lefferts. Yeah, kind of the southeast side of Prospect Park.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah,
Oh, we're not live. So
we're now live. Yeah, but we're supposed to just keep talking and act natural.
right.
Mhm.
Well, I'm originally from Bushwick, but a very different Bushwick.
I can imagine.
Mm.
Yeah.
I mean, even in it's been 15 years that I've been here, and the city it changes every year. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We just hit third. Please keep chatting. I'll let you know when the embeds are up. Okay. I don't know.
Hello. This is our panel. And I don't know, we're starting. Start?
In the chat, they said just keep talking and they'll let us know.
All right. Okay, great. Well, I feel really honored to be meeting all of you right now in this panel and be in conversation with you guys, because I've definitely been admiring your work. I've heard of it and have been in association and conversation with it, even though I haven't known about it. In some ways, in retrospect, like for you, Vanessa, like the mother wound essays, like I've seen those calls and like seen people writing them, and I was like, I'm not ready to write my mother wound essay. When I initially saw that call, and I was like, I'm not ready for that. And so you doing that work, I was really amazed and impressed that someone was like kind of pioneering that. And
thank you. It's taken me a long time so take your time, when you're ready, I think, or when you get ready, I don't know, either or. But it's really difficult work. So I hear you about, not yet. Completely. Do y'all want to share what you're working on? Are you writing right now? I'm hella struggling writing right now.
Yeah, I'll start. I am currently working on, I have a couple stories that are getting ready to roll out. I'm doing one, which I'm really excited about, where I talk about the relationship that me and my family and my mother specifically has to potato salad and how that connects to the Black experience. This whole conversation around who made the potato salad, why that is, where did it come from, and how did it start. That story should be coming out in the next couple of weeks. And then I'm currently writing a proposal for a book that is tentatively titled, I can say tentatively because I know it may end up changing. But basically this concept around like, why do I gotta die? Or why do I have to die? And I'm writing basically about this idea of how, like, through media and through my own lived experience as being queer, the conversation always kind of relates back to this idea of me dying. So like when I was younger, when I told my mom I was queer, her saying you're going to get AIDS, and her being fearful that that I was going to pass away. I was going to talk about in media this conversation around like how Black people always die in horror films, how the lived experience around Black people are always centered around this concept of us dying and why that is and where that comes from. So those are like the two big things that I'm working on right now. But overall, that's about it.
I guess I'll go next. It's always that awkward Zoom pause. Normally in a panel, you like look at one another and like get your nonverbals going. But,
right.
So this is such an interesting time for me. I never wanted to be a science writer, but I'm a scientist and a writer. And my PhD is in molecular microbiology. I study viruses in my PhD, and I have a lot of friends who do virology and immunology. And then I have a component of my work that's public facing. And so this moment has been exhausting for me. I'm doing activism and advocacy work in a way that I haven't in over a decade. And then, I'm working on COVID writing nonstop because there has been so little good information and so much bad information that I just feel sort of an obligation to write about this virus and the disease it causes with the care and the training and the queerness, and yet the scientific literacy that I know I can bring to that work. So I'm working on a collection of essays, and then the essays will be placed next to lyric journal entries, basically. So both kind of very formal reading and thinking through the virus, comparing this virus to the HIV/AIDS plague years, thinking about the advocacy that came from those years, the art that came from those years, and what's happening now. So that very formal thinking next to just like, my partner lost his job and we're worried about money and I can't sleep and I'm drinking too much and, all the things that we're living with on a daily basis. So that's what I'm working on.
So OCO, everyone, I'm Jen Derenwater. I've been working on a few different things. So as some people may know, I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and Native people have been hit really hard by COVID-19. Per capita, we have the highest infection rates in the country on some of our tribal lands. Navajo Nation, the Hopi, the White Mountain Apache, they've all been hit pretty hard in particular. So I've been doing some writing about like what COVID-19 means for Native people, not just in the immediate time, but also in the future. As we're a little less than 2% of the population, and that was before COVID. So some of our tribal nations are really afraid of going extinct right now. So I've done some writing around that. I've done some coverage on the protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder. Excuse me. And then outside of that, I'm now the co-editor for this book called Sacred and Subversive. And it's a collection of first-person essays and poetry written by queer people about their experiences with religion and spirituality. And then outside of that, I'm also trying to put a book proposal together looking at the proposed Petro-Hub corridor in Central Appalachia. And so for that, hopefully, if the book is bought, I'm going to look at sort of the history of resource extraction on that land, timber, coal, and looking at how that history is very connected to the present day push for gas fracking in Central Appalachia. And in that, I want to try to weave in not just the facts, but also personal narrative of the people living on those lands, like the narrative of Native people that were removed from the lands, Black folks who have come there, whether via slavery or migrating there for like working in coal, and trying to include those voices, like what has it been like for the people living in Central Appalachia, and what are we looking at in the future?
Vanessa, what are you working on?
You go, Dana. You go. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I'm currently working on a lot of essays, as there's a lot of things coming up, as I am about 4 days away from one of my gender confirmation surgeries. So there's a lot of emotion that's coming up that I wasn't originally anticipating, and I've been kind of channeling it through essay writing, creative nonfiction memoir type essays. And one which I'm really happy was selected to be published in the Metro Weekly for the OutWrite edition. So you guys should read that one, called Imitation. And I'm also working on a second book of poems right now, kind of reimagining a queer ancestral lineage that I don't really have access to by way of migration, as well as like coercive silence, like in how living in the Islamic Republic currently is, in terms of how queer people can express themselves and gather, and how that specifically makes us like separate from where we have come from. And so I'm basically writing into the unknown for the poems for that particular book. And then I'm also reading for the Rumpus, as well as starting a column there, hopefully soon, within the next couple of months, about Middle Eastern, Southwest Asian, and North African perspectives. And that's something I think is really important right now, because from like the conversation right now is moving away from Middle Eastern, because that centers the conversation around Western imperialism instead of the actual like context of the continent. So there's definitely more of a push towards using the term like Swana, like Southwest Asian and North African. So I think that's a conversation that's still ongoing. And then also there's a lot of conversations about anti-Blackness in the Iranian community as well that I've been personally trying to get involved in, simply because it's really deeply rooted and a lot of people don't talk about it, especially because Iranians can also be seen as a model minority as well, kind of like assimilating to whiteness and kind of getting that white privilege by association. But with the Muslim ban, you can see that it's not really something that is real. So it's like trying to kind of have those really deep, like, kind of community conversations. That's a little uncomfortable to have for the older generation, but I'm really impressed with the younger generation, like the generation coming behind me right now. So there's hope.
I am very impressed that y'all are working so much right now. I am writing finally. I was struggling for a little while. But I am working on my memoir, which I have taken apart a million times. But now is the closest that I feel like to me being ready. I mean, it's something that my mentors have told me. You have to become the writer who can finish the book. So I'm doing a lot of research because I realize that the backdrop of these stories is like my mother grew up in Honduras, this like war-torn nation, but also like how American imperialism had a hand in that, you know? So the world that my mother left to come here to another war-torn nation, you know, she came in the early 1970s, you know, Vietnam War, etc. And then moving to Bushwick, which in the early 1980s, like I remember seeing as a kid, the images of Beirut after the bombings and thinking to myself, that looks like home, but not understanding the profundity of that. So really digging into like the history of Bushwick and the neighborhood and how I can, and also my mother admitting to me a few weeks ago, because we've been in contact since COVID. So that's been huge. That's been enormous for anyone who's read my work. And her finally saying that when she had me, she thinks she had postpartum depression. So also 1970s, like what did that look like, a woman with PPD? And what I found is just devastating. As a mother myself, like, you know, I didn't have PPD, but what would that have been like to not have had any support? And my mother was 22 with 3 children. So also that lens of my mother now sharing stories that are adding so many layers. So I'm writing while also processing, which has also been, I'm just documenting now and doing a lot of research. But interestingly, I have the beginning of the book and I have the last essay in the book. So now filling in the middle, as I'm writing, really seeing that I have the stories because I've been writing them for so long. So now it's just about putting them together. And also with this research that I have, I started this huge project a few months ago where I have a timeline from like 1971 when my mother came to this country to 2000. I'm so far, I'm up to 2004 when I had my daughter. So I have the timeline of my life. And then I've been doing research on like pop culture headlines. And that's been fascinating to see that come up in the work. And I want to show it to y'all because it's kind of like wild. Look at that. Yeah, it has been a ginormous undertaking. And I started it because I felt there was something missing in the book. Like I needed to add something and I didn't know what it was. And I found it in the journey. So that's what I'm working on little by little. And that feels good to kind of see all this research we do. I don't realize where, at least when I started, I know that I feel something. I'm like, something's calling me to do this. So when I do it, because sometimes I don't listen, which I wish I would listen more often to that like voice. It's like, go this way, go that way, you know? So to see that coming together in the book has been fascinating. I'm also the book starts in my mother's garden in Bushwick, Brooklyn, and it ends in my garden. So, because now I have a garden. So also I'm really interested in um, researching like gardening among like immigrant communities and gardening like in trauma and how that's become. So if y'all have, please go in the chat. Like I am doing so much research right now and I am fascinated with what I'm finding. Yes, Alexander Chi's work is just so I'm really fascinated with what I'm finding, and also the realization that my mother built an oasis in a war zone and I built an oasis in the middle of this like unprecedented world event. So yeah, that's where I'm at. And it's not always, it's, you know, a lot of it is still in, but yeah, that's what I'm working on.
Yeah, I just feel so fortunate to have gotten that glimpse into your process as well, and having that sense of like where everyone is at in terms of the pandemic and where we're working towards trying to create better meaning for our communities. So thank you. I'm Jenna Rod, and then these are my esteemed panelists. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. A little bit about me. I'm a poet, editor, and writer based here in Berkeley, California, in the Bay Area. And I have a book coming out next year called Scattered Arrows, my first book of poetry. I'm really excited that it has a home from Milk and Cake Press. And then these are our panelists. We have Jen Deerenwater, Vanessa Martier, Dr. John Paul Higgins, as well as Joseph Ogbinson. And I will introduce our panelists shortly, even though you kind of got a glimpse of our conversation of what was going on behind the scenes, so to speak. And this is going to be a conversation on literary journalism and memoir and how creative nonfiction and those genres kind of blend and antagonize those categories together, because as you can tell, there is a lot of construction that goes into forming what our lived experiences are into words and into paper for people to read. And so we'll start with the bios, and then I'll pose some questions for our panelists, and then we'll take questions from the audience if we have time. So Jen Deerenwater is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, bisexual, two-spirit, and multiply disabled journalist, speaker, and organizer who covers the issues her communities face with an intersectional lens. She's a contributor to Truth Out and a founding executive director of Crushing Colonialism. Jen's work can be found in publications such as Bitch, Rewired.news, and In These Times, to name a few. She's the co-editor of The Sacred and Subversive, and her work is included in the anthologies Disability, Visibility, and Two Spirits Belong Here. She has been interviewed for numerous outlets on her work, and the Advocate named Jen a 2019 Champion of Pride. Welcome, Jen. And then we'll welcome our next panelist, Vanessa Martier, who we were just hearing from and got that glimpse into her beautiful process for her memoir, who's a New York City-based writer, educator, and editor. She's currently completing her memoir, A Dim Capacity for Wings, and chronicles the journey at vanessamartier.blog. A 5-time Vona Voices and 2-time Tin House Fellow, Vanessa's work has been widely published, including in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Long Reads, The Rumpus, and a New York Times bestseller, Not That Bad, edited by Roxane Gay, amongst many others. She is the creator of Writing Our Lives workshop movement and the Writing the Mother Wound movement. She teaches her classes in person in NYC and online, and Vanessa has partnered with Tin House and The Rumpus to publish Writing Our Lives alumni, and is currently partnering with Long Reads to publish Mother Wound essays. Vanessa has also served as guest editor of Asterisk and the James Franco Review. When she's not writing or teaching, you can find Vanessa either on a dance floor, in the gym punching a bag, or in the woods hugging a tree and talking to birds. Same. And then our next panelist is Dr. John Paul Higgins, or DJP for short. They're a speaker, writer, and social justice educator who focuses on issues related to gender, race, and media. They have written for numerous media outlets, including Complex Magazine, Out Magazine, Them, MTV News, and more. They aspire to be an example to those who seek to change the way we discuss the Black queer experience, and is committed to not only being a voice for marginalized people, but more, an inspiration. Dr. Higgins has been in writing journalism fellowship cohorts, including Lambda Literary, Maynard, the Poynter Institute, and currently studies comedy television writing as a fellow in Lena Waithe's Hillman grad program. Dr. Higgins is a current instructor at University of Redlands and New York Film Academy, where they teach research and representation in television and film. You can connect with them on social media by using the handle @DrJohnPaul. And then Joseph, who I'm really excited to hear more from. Joseph Ogbinson is a scientist and writer based in New York City, now in Brooklyn. He has a PhD from the Rockefeller University in molecular biophysics, and his research has been supported by the American Cancer Society, published in leading biological journals. His writing has appeared in numerous places, including the Village Voice, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the Lambda Literary Review. His book, Capsid, A Love Song, won the Paz Award for Best HIV Writing in Fiction and Poetry, and was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award. And then last but not least, he's also a founding member of the COVID-19 Working Group in New York, a science and human rights-based advocacy group addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm also really excited to just get this conversation started, and how we were able to get a little bit of a taste of each other's work and what we're working on. And just to start off, I always find it helpful when we're starting any kind of conversation to define the terms of what we're discussing. And from typically literary journalism is considered a creative nonfiction form that comes closest to newspaper and magazine writing, that is typically fact-driven, requires research, and often interviews. And it typically requires a closer, more active relationship to the subject and to the people that the literary journalist is exploring, whether it's ourselves or other people such as in relationship to ourselves. And then typically, I'm usually really interested in how people get drawn to this genre in writing versus any other. And so that's one of my first questions for the panelists. What originally drew you to writing what we now call literary journalism? Like, what were your goals when you approached this work, whether you came from writing another genre or from a specific other background for writing?
Okay, I'll go. I always like to count to 5 before I go. Um, so I think for me, it was, my dissertation, I have an ed.d. And so having an ed doc, I found that once I published my ed.d. and I started noticing folks, getting their hands on it because it's public, but folks can actually read it. I was getting a lot of individuals who were saying, I loved finding so much of myself in your story. I love finding myself in so much of your participant story. And so when I started thinking about that, I was thinking to myself, how can I ultimately look for issues that are happening out in the world, and then ultimately look at those issues from the perspective of how they're affecting me, and give my perspective around that. Because I found, when I started really kind of writing in journalism per se, my first article didn't go live until 2015. I wrote an article for The Root about Moonlight in a film called Blackbird, and the specifically the issue that I had, this idea that Black queer individuals are always kind of seen as being hurt. And I was basically saying, where can we find the joy? Because I'm happy. I was saying, I've healed, I've gone through therapy. Why are no one writing these stories? Why are no one telling these stories in media? And so when I saw that story go viral, I was going, oh, wow, there are people who are actually connecting with the way that I feel. And so that's really what it comes down to, is that a lot of the things that I feel, a lot of the things that I have issues with, are the things that I feel like is not getting enough attention. I mean, the story that I just wrote for Complex was about LGBTQ individuals and how they're dealing with COVID and how no one is paying attention to the idea that so many of them are homeless and so many of them are struggling with different, issues. No one's talking about that. And so that was ultimately why I wrote that story during Pride Month. I said, I think it's so imperative that if I'm going to be writing anything, I want to make sure that I'm writing something that speaks to me as much as it speaks to the people that are reading my work. And I think ultimately that's what's been driving a lot of the stuff that I've been doing in the last couple of years, is making sure that as much as it's, research and it's interviewing, it really comes down to me ultimately saying, who are the voices that are oftentimes not represented in these stories, and how can I also allow myself to be vulnerable? I've been writing some things, and in the middle of it, my husband walks in, he's like, "Are you okay?" I'm crying because maybe something I wrote, struck a chord, or maybe it was something that I didn't process in therapy, or something I did process in therapy. And I'm like, I need to write about this, right? Like, even for me, I was homeless in college often. And so, now writing about it now, it takes on just a very different way of thinking about things. So with that being said, I think that that's really what it comes down to for me, is really just making it all of it has been personal for me as much as it has been me kind of taking on issues that are happening out in the world as well.
I think my answer is going to be very similar to Dr. Paul's. I mean, I've been writing since I was very, very young, and fiction and stuff, it just never really spoke to me in the way that nonfiction does. I feel like all of the communities I'm a part of, Native, bi, Two-Spirit, disabled, I'm urban based as an adult, but I grew up in rural areas of Oklahoma and Texas. Like, all of my communities suffer from hyper erasure. Like, there are people that think we're not real, we don't exist, so for me, I think part of what's drawn me into journalism in general is trying to have my community seen and recognized, and to be heard, and to be heard by us. Like, it's so important that we're telling our stories because we are the experts on our lives. And I think that, I do some like sort of straight journalism, like news reporting, but I just really like adding more of like an analysis. Like, we'll talk, just COVID-19 in Indian country, for example. Like, if you don't understand the condition of Native people's lives, then you're not going to really understand why we've been so hard hit by COVID, So I think that's really important. And a big part of what's drawn me into this work is just, one, I think being able to see myself reflected in media in ways that I did not growing up. I'm a young generation Xer. So like, I did grow up in a time with computers and stuff, but it wasn't like it is now. You still had to go to an actual library and whatnot. So I just didn't have the same kind of access to media and stories that folks do now. So I think that's part of it, is seeing myself reflected, but seeing my communities reflected, and being able to not just prattle off studies and statistics, but also be able to have that personal voice heard behind it. I think it's so easy to just get lost in facts and figures and things, and not think about what those facts and figures mean on a very real, very personal level. And also, I never in a million years thought I was going to be on a panel with a molecular biologist. Like, I just got to say, like, being a writer and a journalist, like, I've met all kinds of cool people and been in spaces I never would have imagined, like on a panel with a molecular biologist.
I'm on way too many panels with molecular biologists, actually. Yeah, I mean, I'm an older millennial, I guess. I remember the dial-up years myself. For me, I came to everything, I did literature in college, but then continued grad studies in the hard sciences. And I never left reading behind, but I never really considered writing as a possibility for me. I had sort of left that part of my life in the deep, like, hobby world. Like, I wrote, basically, friends and I would read books together and write essays that were emails just back and forth to one another, thinking about the work. So I came to this first really, I love reading essays, and I love reading the type of, creative nonfiction that isn't journalism, but kind of is. I'm thinking of James Baldwin and Joan Didion, and more recently Hilton Als. And these writers, what I loved about them is they showed you their thinking, right? And so when I started writing more publicly, I don't write about things that I know the answer to. I write precisely because I want to figure something out, and something that maybe is sitting in me that is uncomfortable, and that I want to dig into and have sort of a reason to read about and a reason to think. So there's nothing in the world that I think as deeply about as what I'm working on the page, right? Because you're sort of held accountable to the words you put out there. Those words can do good in the world, and they can also do harm. So you don't want to fuck up. You want to be honest. You want to be honest about yourself. And then when I started writing as a, faggot, queer, homosexual, whatever, I think genre is really frustrating for so many of us. And so, I try to, my work often, also the essays are kind of odd in the literary community. They're kind of like, essays in particular are kind of a marginalized, weird thing in and of themselves. Like, tell an agent that you want to publish a book of essays and watch how fast they run away. They don't want to do it. They want to publish a memoir, so I love essays, and that's just what I wanted to do. But I also wanted to break the essay. So the first real essay, I published in the LA Review of Books in 2012, and I was a baby writer. It was like 10,000 words almost. And it was, I called it nonfiction. It's an essay. It was sort of unpacking my generational trauma with HIV, having grown up in the 80s, but having been my whole entire sexual life, HIV was a possibility, and I hadn't really confronted that and what that meant to have queer sex. And the essay ended with two endings, and one in which I get HIV and the other in which I don't. And I called it nonfiction, and it sat there on the page. And I was very lucky to work with an editor who didn't push on that. But that's the sort of thing that I was interested in doing, because those two things were both true to me. I mean, it's just, those were the lives that I saw for myself and the lives that I saw for everyone in my own life. And I needed to be able to write that, otherwise I couldn't confront it in my own life. And so I think that it's all about just thinking so deeply, and then thinking in community, both with writers past that I've learned from, and then trying to think in community with the folks on this Zoom that I'm writing with y'all, and y'all are reading me, and we're trying to do something, think deeply and think differently. And I feel very privileged to be in conversation with nonfiction writers in the world today.
I've been trying to figure out how to answer this question. And one of the things that first came to mind was in college, I took my first creative writing class. I went to Columbia University, and I remember this was the early 1990s, it was mid 1990s, like 93, 94. The professor gave us an assignment. He said, write about something beautiful from your childhood. And I wrote about Teresa. That's not her real name, of course, but and she was, quote unquote, like the neighborhood crackhead. And that's what we call them. And it's a terrible term, but that's what it was, right? And I wrote about how beautiful she was when she was high, because she was happy. And she would sing. And I remember her once standing on the top of a fire hydrant and steadying herself, but she was glorious. But when she was sober, she was so sad. And I think that was my introduction to trauma and what trauma can do, and also addiction. And when the professor gave me the piece back, he said, this isn't writing. And he didn't have the cojones to look at me when he said it. And what he was telling me was what I've been told time and again, directly and indirectly, that there's nothing beautiful about my people, and there's nothing beautiful about where I come from. I'm older than I look, but I grew up 1970s, 1980s, New York City, right? I saw the crack epidemic. I saw the fire wars in New York City that left patches of the city like piles of rubble. And I think one of the main reasons why I started writing about us and where I'm from is to counter that idea that they could never be something beautiful from where that coming out of where I'm from. And to be clear, it's not that crack was beautiful. Fuck that drug and what it did to our neighborhood, our neighborhoods, and how um, the government just left us there to die. They did nothing, you know. Reagan and Nancy Reagan just turned a blind eye to our hoods, you know, and Bush and the presidents that followed and the mayors, and nobody did anything. And I think that's really why I write about where I'm from and my people, to show our beauty and our humanity, and also to show that you can be imperfect and still be beautiful, you know. That's why I read about my brother who died from a heroin addiction, 15-year heroin addiction. And he was a Black man. And seeing now also how this opiate crisis is being dealt with. When it was crack and it was in the hood, it was these poor Black and brown neighborhoods, they did nothing. And now that the opiate crisis has hit white America, it's like, oh, those poor white kids. And listen, it's not that it should not be addressed. I'm saying, but what happened to us? So that's really why I do the work that I do, to show our beauty, our humanity, and our complexity. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a general thread is what I'm hearing from all of you is that need of seeing yourself and your own experience validated in the world around you, and combating those messages when it comes from either being a queer Black man in higher education or coming into a sense of belonging in a society that doesn't want to see you belong. And when I think about that, I kind of am trying to think of like, what do we see in the future of writing in this particular genre? Because as we're having these types of conversations of inserting ourselves into the narrative and creating a different narrative that is disrupting the dominant one and also bringing to light what we specifically are trying to ignore based by the powers that be, because of course it's easier to ignore things that are difficult to solve when they're really symptoms of many systems of oppression. And I think that what we're seeing now in this moment, in our culture, is that we're having a reckoning with that, but also there is a lot of kind of tension between trying to figure out what the future looks like and how we want to better it from where our current present moment. So that's what would be my next question for the panel. Like, what are like your dreams or fears of writing in this genre moving forward in the next about 10-20 years, and how do you see the publishing landscape changing to kind of accommodate that, as we saw with a Dignidad Latina, Dignidad Latinaria, and how we're seeing more paywalls for journalism, but also more access that is being brought to people that perhaps wouldn't have necessarily gotten access to that language and narrative previously.
Okay, no one jumped on. So, you know, I've thought about that a lot. And it's why I created Writing Our Lives, and why I've worked to you know, create these partnerships. I have these partnerships with these organizations, Tin House, Rumpus, Long Reads, because I want to help folks that look like me, right? And don't look like me, like folks who are Black, brown, LGBTQ, disabled, etc. Write their stories, because we have not been given the opportunities to do so. So using my privilege and using, you know, being a real, like, you know, literary community citizen, and getting these stories out. I think about the future of our writing a lot. It stresses me out sometimes, but it's why I'm making moves to, like, for example, have a mother wound anthology. I'm trying to put that together. Not I'm trying, I am putting that together. You know, try not, do or do not. There is no try. Yes, Yoda. And really just being a part of this movement to get these stories, you know, to not be a part of the canon, deconstructing the fucking canon, you know, kind of blowing it up, and creating a new canon that looks more like us. Yeah, I think that's the best way to answer that right now.
You know, I was gonna say, I think what's so interesting about this question is that, you know, these conversations are kind of moving in and I don't really want to call them silos, but I feel like in a lot of the groups that I'm working with or people that I know, we're having these conversations around what's happening right now in this moment. And I think the one thing for me that has, you know, kind of jumped out was yesterday on Twitter, someone had retweeted a story from Eater where they were talking about, someone had written an article basically saying that Black folks, when we're asked to write, we're only asked to write about our, you know, our culture or our experiences in different things, but we're not given the space to be able to write about everything else per se, right? And I had retweeted it basically saying, as a writer, like there's so much more to me than just my Black, queer, fat, non-binary experience, right? Like I love tech, I'm an Apple head, like I love, you know, I love food. Obviously I'm fat, I love to eat. So it's like, why am I not given space as a Black writer? I've pitched so many stories and I've had so many individuals come back and say, you know, oh, well, we don't think this is a good fit for us. And I'm asking, well, it looks like it is because someone else just wrote something very similar to it a year ago, you know, as I've gone through your writing. And so I think for me is, you know, one of the things that I've been really thinking about, and much like you, Vanessa, and I actually have a note that I want to connect with you offline about this, is how do I give space to other Black, queer, fat, femme, whatever folks like myself to be able to speak about experiences that normally wouldn't get picked up on a different outlet. Things that ultimately, you know, like even for myself, right? You know, there have been like the potato salad story. I know it's very simple and it may seem very silly, but I have been literally pitching that story for almost a year. And it took a year for an outlet to finally say, yes, we want you to actually tell that story. And so it's somewhat frustrating to me as a writer that, you know, like, you know, as much as I'm wanting to write about my experience, I get lumped into just an area of, you know, oh, you're a Black writer, so you need to write about Black things. Or you're a queer writer, you need to write about queer things. It's like, no, there's so much more to us. So I think for me, in answering your question, that's something that I've been truly focused on, is figuring out how do I open up the, you know, kind of open up the Pandora's box around us being so much more than just pain, or being so much more than just the oppression and the marginalization that are put onto us as marginalized people.
Yeah, I second, third, all of that. You know, I'll say since the resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock, there has been a little bit more of a consciousness of, you know, so-called America to go, oh wait, Indians still exist, they're still alive. So like I do feel like I get asked to write, but it's usually, oh, just write about this Native story. And for the most part, I'm okay telling these stories. Like I want them to be heard, I want them to be seen. I think what I get frustrated with sometimes, particularly around like Native and Indigenous issues, is that a lot of publishers just want like poverty porn. They want like a misery porn. They just want to hear about the poor, downtrodden, you know, drunk, drug addict Indian living on the res kind of thing. And that story needs to be heard, but I think there's a way to tell a vast array of stories, because indigeneity is complex. There is not just one way to be Indigenous, you know? And so there's thousands of stories that need to be told and need to be heard. And yeah, we should talk about the poverty and the pain and trauma and genocide we're still facing, but I think there's also a way to talk about our beauty and our resilience. I mean, look at what we have been through for over 500 years. And yes, a lot of us were murdered along the way, but we're still here. Like that says a lot about Native people. And that needs to be told, just like with queer folks and disabled folks. Like I'm so encouraged by the book Disability Visibility. It's edited by Alice Wong, and it's a collection of pieces by disabled and chronically ill people. And it's amazing. Like, as I read more of the book every day, I'm just always blown away, like talking about the various experiences of being disabled and chronically ill and what that looks like. You know, disabled people, our community is really diverse, you know, where every religion, ethnicity, racial group, educational level, age, you know, based around the world, you know, and there's so many stories to be heard. And I think Alice Wong did such an amazing job bringing those stories in and talking and hearing us talk about our hardships, but also talk about where we're going and what we hope for. And I think that's a really important part of this particular canon of writing. And also, just as I'm getting older, thinking more about how do I help, like, how do I use my social capital to help other writers like me and other marginalized writers tell their stories? You know, how do we do that? And that's part of why I started Crushing Colonialism, which you can learn more about us at crushingcolonialism.org. So yeah, I had to get the little plug in there. So yeah, I think we still have such a long way to go, especially if we're going to talk about mainstream press. I am still incredibly disappointed with mainstream media on a very regular basis, but I think we're heading in a good direction, and I hope that it continues to grow and we continue to have more voices being heard that have, you know, typically been erased, or the stories told in a way that's just really negative. And I can't wait to read the potato salad story. That sounds amazing. I'm excited for that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely, Jen. I think what has been so special about the last 10 years is there are places like the Rumpus that exist that give space for stories to be told in a different way. But if I look at like mainstream publishing, they still don't have space for folks like us way too often. And is this, if this is being recorded, I might get in trouble, but you know, if you didn't go to Iowa and you want to write lyrically, you're going to have a hard time selling your book. Like, if you want to write a book of essays and you're not, you know, one of a very small number of people who has somehow proven that they can do that, even though books of essays sell, you're going to have a hard time selling that book to a mainstream publisher who will be able to, number one, pay you what that work is worth, and then number two, support and guide your book out into the world to meet new readers. So, you know, I see one thing, you know, Kiese Lehman, who is, you know, was a teacher of mine and a friend, you know, I think really proved that we can find readers for our work. Like, we have, you know, people want to read stuff that is different, and people in our communities want to read stuff that we're working on. But, you know, that is, selling that to mainstream press is really still, I think, a challenge. These stories of like, you have this amazing pitch and it still takes a year, you know, and we're all folks who have like been doing this, been in the game for some time, and it still is just like pulling teeth sometimes. And then I think about the moment that we're in, which is one that is just so full of despair, and none of it is new. It's like the shit that's happening with the pandemic and the shit that is happening, you know, with the Black Lives Matter movement. These are all pre-existing structural fractures in our society that are just all being pulled out so intensely right now. And you can't, I mean, it is just so apparent. So the only hope I can see in this despair is that like, it is impossible to turn away from these structural fractures. And you do see movement in publishing, hiring like Black and people of color in like head of publishing houses. That's never happened before. So there are some things that are starting to move, but it's hard to imagine that that world is really going to have space for the type of writing that I want to see at the level that I want to see it. And that's why places like the Rumpus are so important. I read that shit all the time, you know, and as much or more than I read the New York Times or the New Yorker. And so that makes me happy. That I find hope in that we've been able to build spaces to read one another's work when mainstream publishing has no place for us.
Can I just add something?
Yes, please.
I think that I've really been thinking about also, if there is no room for us, or they don't want to make room for us, what are we gonna do? You know, I blog. I don't blog as much as I used to, but I think um, in 2016, it seems like so long ago. Was it 2016? I challenged myself to write an essay a week, a personal essay a week. I called it the Relentless Files, right? And what I was doing was, I have this like an issue with perfectionism. It has not gone away, but I realized that it was really self-sabotaging, right? And I needed to get out of my own way. So I was like, I'm gonna write this, and it does not have to be perfect. I'm just gonna put it out into the world. And what that did for my writing, and also what that did to people like reading my work. That's how I got all the followers. That's how I started, like people started reaching out to me, like Bitch Magazine, can you write this? You know, the Rumpus, we would love to partner, right? So also taking my writing, like my power back, taking it away from any other publishing entity, really shifted things for me. So I've also thought about how I can do that again. And it's terrifying because I've been working on this memoir for so long. Like, I want to sell it. I want a 6-figure, advance. I deserve that. But also, will I not publish the book because they don't want to give me that? That's me giving my power away. And while that's terrifying for me, and I'm like, I have like issues with self-publishing for various reasons, which is not part of this conversation. We could talk about it another time. But like, would I self-publish to get this work out in the world because it's so important to me? Hell yeah. So I think also we have to really start thinking about like what publishing is for us and what it's going to look like for us. And if we're going to keep giving our stories to folks who, do they value our stories? Yeah.
That's such an important question, because that's also one that like I've been struggling with myself when it comes to moving towards like a career trajectory of like, how do I want this work to be marketed? Like, I don't want it to be marketed as like as a trauma narrative. That's the only definition in what I think Jen was saying earlier, like poverty porn. Like, yes, that story is important and deserves to be elevated and given light to because it hasn't previously, but then we also run the risk of it becoming the only story that defines us and defines our communities. And what it does is also kind of pigeonholes us as writers, because then we're not given the full breadth of our skill set, and that we're able to move forward into writing something about the new Apple iPhone by a Black queer non-binary writer, or by actually like moving forward and writing about something that doesn't have to do with like our marginalized identities, and resisting against a mainstream system that doesn't value that. And Vanessa, I also too have that question as well, is like, okay, they value the story, but are they only valuing it because they can sell it and like market it in a particular way? Or are they actually seeing me as a fully realized person, that this is one story? And like, because I think all of us have multiple selves, and multiple selves that we take on and that we shed given the context. And that when we're writing, we do kind of take on one of those selves in order to kind of write that perspective. And I think that what it comes down to is like, for me, the question really is like, do we still engage in doing that work without risk of it being misunderstood? And like, what does that mean for our writing? And are we trying to like exploit that for our own benefit, or are we trying to dismantle that, such as like, for example, of like the Rumpus, and that we're creating our own avenues? But like, as someone, who has like worked at many lit magazines, like most of those organizations are volunteer run. and they're being run by like the labor of love and passion by the individuals, right? And I want to also see those people get compensated for that really important work that they're doing. But it's also like running into the same idea of like, okay, now we're like in a capitalist system trying to get reimbursed for our labor that doesn't seem to be valued unless it is getting paid for. So that would be my next question for you guys as we kind of like wrap up, and how can we exploit that system for our own benefit? How can we resist it, and how can we like dismantle it in our new own way?
Yeah. So, kind of, this is the thing that I've had to deal with. I went from, so when I first started kind of like writing from like 2017, I had something very traumatic happen to me. It was very public facing and everyone was on top of it. And then that's when all of the news organizations started coming towards my way. And then in 2018, I was everywhere and I was writing and I was writing and I was writing. And then I went through like maybe a year of basically saying like, I don't feel like I'm genuinely writing anything that's really changing the way that we talk about queer Black narratives in media. And so in 2019, I kind of took a break. And I told myself at the top of this year, I said, I will only take stories where I have a mutual understanding with the editor that the way I tell this story is the way I want to tell this story. And in the sense of like, because there were times where editors, I would start off on a story and I was so passionate about it. And then an editor would say, well, take this and do this and do that. And then by the time the story was done, it wasn't my story anymore. And I was okay with it because I was going, okay, well, you're paying me, my rate, what I'm asking for. So, I'm not going to, say no to money because I'm a freelancer, right? But this year I told myself, I said, you know what? I said, I need to become more aligned with telling stories and writing things that I want to write about and writing about them in a way that it's very authentically me. And so I think that that's the thing, for me, how I've been able to feel like I'm not, quote unquote, and I hate using this word, but I think this is the best way for me to say it, quote unquote, like a sellout, right? Because we all got to eat, right? And then there's capitalism, and then there's all these other pieces, of the puzzle, right? Especially right now with COVID, like the whole thing of, my money not looking the same because I'm an educator and the education system was already broken. And now because of COVID, it's even worse, right? So I'm constantly in this place of like, where's my next check gonna come from? But I think that there's this onus for me when I put something out and I know that it's so personal and I know that it's exactly the way that I wanted it to be, like specifically even thinking about just the complex story I did in June. I was so emotionally connected to that story. And the editor was like, hey, tell it the way you want to tell it. And they let me, and they paid me the rate that I asked for. And it was just very much, it was my story. It was the interviews, the way I finessed the story. And so I think that there's this thing for me, I always tell people, money and capitalism, it's very, very much, it's nasty and it works a certain way. But I think for me, it's, when you're authentic and when you can tell your stories and you can say, I'm telling the story exactly the way that I want to tell it, the right people will find you, the right people will ask for that story, and the money will come. And that's what I'm finding now, right? This year, I have not had to worry about really anything. Even with COVID, I've been given opportunities. And even this is a great opportunity for me that came. And so I'm really in this place now where I'm going, the more authentic I am and the more relentless I become about telling people no. Because like I got an email this morning, someone was asking me to do something related to Ava DuVernay's 13 film. And I basically had to tell her, is there a budget? And she said no. And I said, well, thank you. Let me know when you have one, right? Like there becomes this thing of like, when I can tell an editor, I've done too much and I've worked too hard for you to still be asking me to do something for free. You're not selling yourself short. And I think that's the thing I really want folks to get out of this conversation is, when I first started writing, I was taking everything because I was selling myself short. And now when I go to something or when I pick something, I go, I'm Dr. John Paul. I don't have anything to explain to you. Like my accolades are there. I've written for 26 places. I've written 126 articles. I don't owe you anything at this point. Like I have a doctorate degree for that. I can write. Like that's the thing I have to remind myself. I am a Black queer writer. I have a doctorate degree. I can write. So I am no longer in this place as a writer. And I think that this is something that even for me, sometimes I have to remind myself and I have to hear. I think because we get so caught up in, oh, how am I going to pay my bills? we sell ourselves short. And because the system tells us take what you can get, right? As marginalized people, even as queer people, take what you can get. You've survived for this long, so take that and grab it and run. And now I'm going, nah, fuck that. I'm going, y'all are going to put some respect and some sugar on my name because I have worked too hard to build the reputation that I have from scratch. And that's the thing, like Dr. John Paul, the brand behind Dr. John Paul wasn't given to me. This was not something that somebody said, oh, here, Dr. John Paul, you can have this. No, I worked for this shit. So I tell people all the time, stop letting these editors screw you over when it comes time for you to ask for your money. Pay the rate or we're not going to work together at all. And so that's the thing that's kept me balanced and saying, I'm going to tell the story the way I want to tell it because I have the accolades to do that. But at the same time, I also recognize my worth and the worth of my story. And I want people who are watching this, even y'all, like to take that with you, because again, the game that people are playing, well, because of COVID, we don't have a budget. Well, that means that we can't work together. Thank you. I appreciate you reaching out. But that's really what it comes down to for me.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think about all the years of unpaid or lowly paid labor I've put into every world that I've worked in. Before I started doing journalism, I worked in campaigns. You want to talk about doing a lot of low paid and free labor. Oh my God, work on political campaigns. And sadly, journalism is not a lot different. I've written stories that require travel and interviews for as low as $40. And I understand over here running this small nonprofit on a shoestring budget. Like some of us, it's just harder to find the money to fund the projects. But I personally do not feel comfortable asking any marginalized person to work for free. When Crushing Colonialism does stuff, even if I'm like, all we can manage is $50, like, I understand if that's not enough, but I'm going to pay you something because that's important. Like, and it's not just your time and your labor and your talents. It's often that you're opening up and you're sharing your trauma with people. And that's hard. That's hard to do. I mean, let's think about that. Like I may be sitting at my kitchen table right now, but who knows who's watching this? Like I'm sharing parts of myself with the world that are difficult to talk about. I like that some media and news outlets are going the nonprofit route. I think that in some ways allows for broader, more diverse voices. But of course, you still have the nonprofit industrial complex, which is real. You still have to appeal to the funders, which are the same people that are running the corporations and, mainstream media and stuff. I think something that I really want to touch on for me that impacts me as a writer and a lot of other disabled people is that in order to keep all the health and disability services that I need to survive, I have to live in poverty. I will never make enough money to pay my medical expenses, to live in a safe, accessible apartment, to have a home health aide. I will never make enough to pay for those things myself. So in order to get them through the government, I have to stay in poverty. And so what that means is that I don't ever really get to ask for what I'm worth. I sometimes have to turn down paid opportunities that I really want to take because, oh no, I've already reached my maximum in what I can earn this month. And, that grossly impacts me. And this is a form of ableism that's harming my career, but it's also impacting other people like me. When one Native journalist doesn't ask for what they're worth, that makes, the ex-editor or whoever think they can ask a Native journalist for less, or a queer or a disabled journalist or writer for less money. So there are still like really large issues of systematic oppression outside of the publishing world that keep me from getting paid what I deserve, and that's something we need to think about when we talk about writing and news is like, who's getting heard, who's getting paid, look at who has the best jobs versus which journalists are on Medicaid because they don't make enough to afford their own insurance. There's just so much there and so many structural forms of oppression that keep us from getting what we're worth. But I think that in opportunities like this, it gives us the chance to talk about these things and to talk about these problems, and also to then go behind the scenes and talk amongst ourselves and figure out, like, how do we fix this? Who do we work with? Who do we not work with? You know, I think that that is another really important part of that, is just sort of this collective work behind the scenes to support each other.
I'll just say something really quickly. I am stubborn as fuck and always wanted to write long form, weird essays. And the way that I figured out at the beginning when I started writing, I'm just like, I have a job. Like, my job is not writing, and it never will be. And for me, it makes me feel like that gives me the agency to write what I want to write, and then to publish that in the world, whether it's going to make $0 or $50 or $1 a word. And I've gotten every one of those and in between. And so just that makes me feel grounded. That makes me feel like I have agency, that I can do the work that I think is the most important. And like Vanessa was saying, like, if that means I have to put it out on a blog or self-publish it, that is my work. That is, my time is precious, and my writing time even more so. And so I don't want to be chasing $150 freelance checks. That just, like, I can't do that. My time is, it's almost like my time is more valuable than the $150 fucking dollars. And I want to write stuff that is important to me. So that is, I just have a job. And then checks are nice, but I don't need them.
Right. Vanessa, parting words from you.
Yeah, I just, I'm stubborn also. So when you said you were stubborn, Joseph, I was like, yes. And I also, I'm hella generous, and I really believe that it will come back to you. And it always has. I quit my job. It's the last full-time job I had in 2010. And I did it as a single mom. I'm no longer single. My wife is an electrician. That has definitely changed my life. I will say it. But I was a single mom for 10 years. And it taught me. And my motivation was like, I want to live my dream, and I want my daughter to see what it looks like and to live it with me, and to see what you can do when you're generous and you're kind. Not nice. I don't do nice. Nice people get walked all over. But be kind and generous, and focus on the work that is important to you, and it will come back. But and I've struggled with poverty, and no matter what, we have bills to pay. We have to take care of ourselves. But I'm not willing to sacrifice myself, my truth, my authenticity, my power for money. I'm not willing to do that. And really, that has really made all the difference for me. So those are my parting words. Thank you, y'all.
Thank you so much for this conversation. Where can people find you if they'd like to follow your work?
VanessaMartier.com. I'm also on social media, but I am on a social media break. And I don't know when I'm going back, because my mental health, my emotional health is like, you need to get off. And it was a very, very great thing for me. Has been so far.
Yeah, you can find me. I'm all over Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and then also my website, jendeerenwater.com. It's JenDeerinwater.com. And you can learn about Crushing Colonialism at crushingcolonialism.org. And we are also on social media.
You can find me at josephogbinson.com, on Twitter, Reluctantly Joe, and the podcast Food, the number 4, and Thought spelled THOT. Had to get that in there.
You can find me at drjohnpaul.com, as well as at Dr. John Paul on all social media platforms, and also on Jim Lanahan and Friends, which is a new podcast on Apple, and then also Learnt podcast with my friend Kevin Allred. And yeah, that's
it. Can I just add also writingourlives.com, the workshops that I created. You can check them out there too.
Yes. All right, this is me signing off. My name is Denna Rod. You can find me at dennarod.com or at A Lightning Rod on Twitter and Instagram, and at Denna Lightning Rod on Facebook. And I just want to say, I feel really honored to have shared space with everyone this afternoon, morning, wherever time zone you're in. And I hope that we can continue these conversations and be able to make it better for the writers that are going to come behind us, as well as trying to make a sustainable future for all of us in this world. Thank you so much. I hope that we can see each other soon.
OutWrite.
Yeah, thank you, OutWrite. Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Dave.